So in this final module, we're going to go through a series of shorter videos covering more standalone features of Rider that I didn't quite feel fitted into a dedicated module. And first off, we're going to start off by looking at the HTTP client. So if I Control Alt and S to get the settings up again, and we go to plugins, and we type HTTP in here, making sure that you're on the install tab. If we scroll down a bit, I think lots of these will have HTTP in the description, hence why there's lots of results. And we've got HTTP client here, and notice that it's bundled, so you'll already have that installed anyway. Also, while we're here, just make a mental note that that's bundled as well, because we'll be looking at the endpoints tool window as part of this video too. So if I close that, I've created the stock web API project, and I use controllers, so it's just got the standard weather forecast controller. When you create this, it also creates a file with the .http extension. If I double click on this, and we have actually shown this functionality earlier on in this course, but I can click play and it will make that request. Now I'm not actually running it, so if I do play up here, so I'm doing that up here to actually run our API, and then I click play on the request, then we can see at the bottom here, if I make that a bit bigger, we can see the response. We can also see headers, so we can expand that, and we can see that the response has syntax highlighting. We are seeing this as part of the services tool window, and we can see here we've got HTTP request. There's other things like Docker and Kubernetes, which we'll look at in another video in this module. But there's quite a few different things bundled as part of this services tools window. So let's collapse this and stop our API. And then let's have a look at this HTTP file. So we can see it's got the concept of variables, and we'll talk more about variables in a sec. We're doing a get request, so we can replace this for different verbs. So I could do post or delete or put. We can see that this is using that above mentioned variable, and we can see that we've got headers here. So I can, as I type, I can control space. We can prompt it to give us auto completions, or we could have started typing. You can see authorization there and lots of different common and known headers. We can also, if this was say a post request, I could then put a body in there. So I could say, I don't know, that kind of thing. Now we can see that we've not got syntax highlighting there, but if I do content type, application, JSON, then that's given us the syntax highlighting. So as we're doing here, we can obviously use this to test our own API that we're developing in. We can also use it to test third-party APIs that maybe our application is using. And one huge advantage here is that it's source controlled, so other team members can pull these down and use them. And it also works as really good documentation too. So if I did a git clone on a project I wasn't familiar with, and there was a bunch of HTTP request files, this is going to really help me understand what that API is doing. And also it allows me, in the same way as when we're talking about the Git integration, it allows me to stay in the IDE. So when I'm doing things with Git, when I'm coding, when I'm doing these requests, rather than having to alt tab to something like Postman or Insomnia, I can just stay in Rider and keep myself in the zone by just staying within the same application. So you'll notice that there's these three hash symbols, or pound, depending on where you're viewing this from. This basically allows you to have multiple requests. So I could do, well, let's just copy this and put that there, and then change this back to a GET request like it was before. Let's delete that. So I can have multiple requests within the same file. So you can see we've got these two play buttons, they're separate. We can also add a comment here. So I could say post new weather forecast. That probably doesn't make sense. There isn't a post endpoint in this, but you get the idea. You can add a comment. So again, this adds to this concept of using this as documentation. There's various buttons along the top in this toolbar. So we've got add, so we can add different types of requests. So a new GET request, a new post. There's a few examples here, including forms and GraphQL and gRPC as well. So it's not just REST requests, you can also deal with gRPC. If we click here, we can see a history. So if I just go back to here and let's run this a few times. Oh, it's not running at the moment. Let's run it again. Then collapse that. So if I run this a few times, and then let's do the post one. It's going to fail because we don't have a post endpoint, but we can see that fail saying method not allowed because there is no post endpoint. If I collapse this now, and then we go back to that history, then we can see the history of those requests. And we can run them again as well. If I close that, we've also got this. It's grayed out at the moment, but if I select one and say convert to curl and copy, then we can see that that has been pasted to the clipboard. So then I can use that in other places. On the flip side, going in the other direction, if you're using Chrome DevTools, for example, and you right click on a network request and say copy to curl, to then be able to go onto this next button and say import, and I can choose from a Postman collection or a curl command and paste this in from Chrome DevTools. Next along, we've got run all requests in this file, which is fairly obvious. Let's talk about these environments now. We've already seen variables locally, but sometimes you might have different environments like dev, QA, production that have different settings. You might have a local environment, which is localhost. You might have a dev one, which is a deployed dev, or a QA one, which is a deployed QA, which has a different domain name. And there might be various other variables that depend on your environment. So that allows you to use these variable placeholders within the request. But if we click on this drop down, we've got no environments at the moment. So I can choose add environment to public file or private file. If I do public file, then it creates this file. Sure, add it to Git. And this is the environment name, and then it's just key value pairs. So I could then say base URI. Let's change the value for what we have here. And let's delete that now. And you can see we've got linting because that variable doesn't exist anymore. If I type base URI, we've got the auto completion, and we can do the same down here as well. And we've still got the linting. If I hover over it, it said environment not selected. So even there, it's hinting what the issue is. So if I do this now, because we've created dev, then I can select that, and now the warning goes away. So it will do that replacement. That file is alongside your HTTP file. So http client.env, that's here. So I can manually edit this, and it's in my project, so it's source controlled along with my HTTP file. If I go back to here and do add environment to private file, then this creates another file alongside called private.env. Note that by default, this is not git ignored, so you do need to make sure that you add this to your git ignore file so that your private variables aren't source controlled. So that's the main difference between these two. If I right click here and go to Git, I can say git exclude, so I can add that to my git ignore file from here. If we go back to the HTTP file and go further along, we've got some AI actions, so we can do stuff with AI. If we go further along to examples, this has a whole bunch of different examples. So let's have a look at gRPC requests. So it supports gRPC. If we go to requests with tests and scripts, we can actually put JavaScript scripts in. So this symbol basically says that this will happen after the request finishes. If we scroll further down, we can see that there's a less than symbol. So this happens before the request is sent. So you can modify the request before it's sent using this with the less than symbol. You can also modify the response afterwards by using the greater than symbol. And then we've got like response here, and you get IntelliSense and everything. I can't edit this one because it's an example, but this is a great starting point if you do need this kind of functionality. Let's go back to our request now. Other things we can do. So if I start a new request, we've spoken about live templates before. And if I do shift and type live templates and then go to this and other languages, and we've got HTTP request. So if I expand that, we can see some of the different live templates here. So let's just demo this with GTR. That's a normal GET request. So if I type GTR tab, then that auto completes for us. So there's all these little time-saving things that we can use. What else do we have? So we can do Control, Alt, and F, and that opens up the structure window, which we've seen before when looking at code, but that also works here, so we can look at the structure of our HTTP file. And lastly in this video, I mentioned the endpoints toolbar earlier. So if I do Shift and type endpoints, that takes us over here to this pane. And this is really useful. This will show you in your project the different endpoints. If I click on here, we can see the HTTP client down here, so I can run it straight from here. Or I can right click and say generate request in HTTP client. So that will then create it over here. And there's different, we can see OpenAI spec, documentation, examples. So it's got the curl here. This also works if your project is a gRPC project, which is really useful because obviously gRPC is typed for the requests and responses, and your endpoints can document that. So going to this endpoint, if it was a gRPC project, when doing the generate request in HTTP client, so it does the gRPC stuff, then that can auto-populate the structure of the request and the response. So to summarize, this is just amazing if you're dealing with APIs, whether it's gRPC or REST APIs, to be able to put these files with your project source controlled, to be able to do gRPC as well as HTTP, to be able to quickly switch between different environments. So obviously I didn't change the names, but if I did go to one and I change these names here, so it could be dev, QA, staging, production, then I can source control this. Obviously don't do that with your own secrets. You put that in the private version. And then from here, within Rider, I can just run them, switch between environments, and it just works. You get a really nice UI showing the response. It gets saved to a file. We can see the history as we saw before. We can import from curl, which is amazing if you're, as I said before, right-clicking in Chrome DevTools and saying copy request to curl. And lastly, it also supports, if I just go back to these examples and we look at with authorization, this shows various different methods we can use authorization in our requests as well.